Welcome to Humanities 2. This is Lecture 2 in the 12-part series, and today we'll be looking at the Reformation. I'm C. Ivan Spencer, your professor for this course, and let's proceed looking at some of the key themes here. First, we're going to be looking at, in the Reformation, at some of the theological debates that are going on at that time. We're going to look at a lot of the changes that are going on in the world at that time, social reform, political reform. All kinds of changes are going on. This is the 16th century is a time of incredible social, political, and geographical change. And then specifically, we're going to look at the free will debate between Erasmus and Luther because of its enduring significance for all kinds of things, especially for modernity, that we'll be looking at in the subsequent lectures. So we're looking at a time period here from about 1517 to 1648, 130 years. Some of the key texts that we'll look at in this lecture series will be Erasmus's On Freedom of the Will, Martin Luther's On Bondage of the Will, and both of those were written kind of together as a response to each other. It's a debate. They're written to respond to each other. And then lastly, we'll look at some of Calvin's Institutes on the Christian religion. So first of all, let's discuss what is the Reformation. Most people think of the Reformation as the Protestant Reformation. And it is mostly a Protestant effort, but there are also reform efforts that are going on in the Roman Catholic Church as well. The Protestant Reformation movement sought to reform Christianity's most prevalent organization, the Roman Catholic Church. And there had been all kinds of different reform movements that had preceded Luther. Luther wasn't the first one to come along and to suggest reforms. But his reform efforts are going to be the ones that stick, the ones that work, the ones that have the most effect, and in some cases calamitous effects, not just upon the church, but upon civilization at large. So now let's look at some of the external factors that are going on at this time that are leading up to the Protestant Reformation. Now remember, we had already looked at the Renaissance in the previous lecture, so we're going to kind of tie in with that as well. So one of the things that's occurring at the early part of the 16th century is a lot of geographical expansion. Of course, you know, Columbus discovered the New World in 1492, but there were also geographical explorations and expansions going on the other direction towards the east. And so Vasco da Gama sails around the coast of, or the Cape of Good Hope in 1497. And so there are attempts to spread out around the globe and to explore it. Now these are mostly driven by the nation states themselves. Portugal is one of the foremost in this effort. Spain, of course, is also foremost. These are two of the most seagoing exploratory nations on the planet at that time. And they are making vast discoveries around the world. And so this is going to bring a great amount of economic prosperity to these countries. Portugal and Spain are going to be awash in gold and in wealth for the next century due to these expansion efforts. France and England are also going to want to get in on this game and to expand around the globe as well. And so all of these four nation states want to establish colonies around the world, and so they can bring in wealth to their mother country. These nations valued their sovereignty, and they were trying to find ways to control and also eliminate the control of the papacy. And so even though Spain has been and always probably will be intensely Roman Catholic, there were attempts to control the amount of power that the papacy had. And of course, the other countries, especially England later on after Martin Luther, will try to control the amount of power that the papacy has over them. Henry VIII, for example, will split away from Rome and establish himself as the leader of the church there in England. And so these nation states are jealous of their sovereignty. And this geographical expansion that's going on is one way to expand their sovereignty to strengthen it. Okay, up to the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, the papacy enjoyed a lot of power. For example, Innocent III during the Crusades was the most powerful man in Europe. He was able to control kings and queens of Europe just by the stroke of his pen. And he used a lot of tools of spiritual persuasion to do this. For example, excommunicating people, or by relieving a king's subjects of their obedience, and so forth and so on. And so the Pope had an incredible amount of power to control the monarchs of Europe. But as these nation states began to be born and to mature, they're trying to find ways to control the papacy. In Luther's day, the papacy still had that level of power in the Holy Roman Empire, that would be modern-day Germany, and also in Italy. Now, neither the Holy Roman Empire or Italy were nations at this time, at the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. They trailed behind the other four nations to the west, the big powerful nations to the west. Remember, we talked about that when we discussed Machiavelli, how Machiavelli wanted Italy to become a full-blown nation state, but it trailed behind. So the Holy Roman Empire and Italy did not become nations until the 19th century, so 350 years after Luther. And so, of course, the Holy Roman Empire became Germany. So this basically sets up Italy and Germany for a kind of stagnation as the other nation states to the west grow and bristle with power, expanding around the globe. Germany and Italy are just kind of left in the dust, okay? And so one of the effects of this is it led the German peasants and some nobility to see Luther as some type of, not just a social reformer, but almost as a messianic figure, because he hoped that he could help them to break the kind of ice that had held them down for so long, and that they could break free and become like these nation states, these highly developed nation states to the west. Now, there was another thing going on. There was a lot of inflation at this time period. Spain was importing all kinds of gold into the New World right about the time of Martin Luther, in 1517, the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Now, Spain is bringing in all this gold from the New World, and it's causing a lot of inflation back in Europe. It's said that silver lay in the streets of Seville and other port cities in Spain because nobody would even pick it up. It was worthless. It'd be kind of like you seeing a penny today laying on the ground somewhere in a parking lot, and you don't even pick it up because you know it's worthless. And so what this did, this inflationary effect of gold, was it made the gold that Germans had go down in value. And so if you were a little German peasant and you had saved your whole life for a little piece of gold, well, now all of a sudden that gold was worth far, far less. And so the German people were being squeezed, and they felt it. Now, the papacy also felt this squeeze because, this inflationary effect, took place everywhere, and it affected even the papacy itself. But the papacy made up for it by all kinds of fundraising efforts that they had, and we'll go into some of those here in just a minute. One of the ways that they made up for it was through the selling of indulgences. Now, the papacy at this time was involved in a grand project, and this was the building of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, the very centerpiece of the Vatican until this day. One of the most elaborate buildings in the history of the planet. This building today, it's estimated if it was rebuilt today, would cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $12 to $15 billion. And so it's essentially made out of semi-precious stones. It's truly a magnificent building with unparalleled kind of splendor and opulence. And so this was a grand project that the popes were engaged in, and it essentially covered many different papacies. In other words, not just one pope was involved in the building of it, but it took an enormous amount of money to build this building. And like all great palaces that kings and queens around Europe had, this essentially projects power out. It's a grand power symbol, but it's also a spiritual symbol for the Roman Catholic Church. But the bottom line is it took a lot of money, just extraordinary sums of money to build this. And so the Pope was constantly looking for ways to raise money. And he needed tens of thousands of ducats of gold every month to keep this project going and to finish it. These rising nation states at this time were desiring full autonomy and full sovereignty, and this political shift during the Reformation will continue to fuel it, especially in the Scottish and English Reformations. We'll see that later on as well when we discuss those some. England, France, and Spain, Portugal, these are the big four nations to the west. They had already shifted politically to become nations, and they were very different from an empire like the Holy Roman Empire, which, as Voltaire said accurately, it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. It was not truly an empire, even though, like for example, Charles V was called an emperor, but he didn't function as a true emperor, say, for example, the way Caesar did, or Augustus Caesar, okay? So nations at this time currently dominate the political world at the time of Luther. But in the Holy Roman Empire, like I said, simultaneous with Machiavelli in Italy, the emerging political concept didn't work there. It didn't take hold. And one of the primary reasons it didn't was because the Pope had such a hold on the Holy Roman Empire and upon Italy that those two geographical areas did not become nations for 350 years. Now, sovereign nation states really don't want any old medieval structures like the Roman Catholic Church, the papacy, or feudalism with its lords, vassals, knights, and serfs. They really don't want anything like that. Nations engender a middle class, and this middle class is upwardly mobile, wealthy. They make money through trade. The kings then tax the middle class, and then the kings use, or queens use that money to build a standing army or a standing navy to protect its mercantilist efforts, and also to expand around the world in geographical expansion, or to fight wars with other nations that would seek to take them over at the time. Now, they're ruled by monarchs, these nations are, who protect the kind of proto-capitalistic economic and mercantilist ventures of the day. And like I said, the middle classes pay a lot of taxes. This arrangement gives a nation sovereignty and power to compete with rivals for new territories, and they were indeed rivals. They were racing around the globe to claim vast sections of the globe. Just take a look at Spain itself, probably the most well-known, claims pretty much all of South America, Central America as its territory, and had plans to claim North America until the English arrived. So they explored vigorously around the globe to lay claim to whatever lands they could conquer and to colonize. And they were able to do this because the Europeans at this time had so much more, well, technology. The great book, Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, it basically explains this quite well. How the Europeans had excellent steels, they had excellent metals, they had, and they also were able to dominate and conquer the lands that they found through some type of an unknown secret that no one really understood, and that was that they carried all these crowd diseases with them. So, for example, most of the New World was wiped out. The populations were wiped out due to diseases that the Europeans carried in their bodies. But no one understood disease or germ theory at that time. And so many of the people simply died because the Europeans brought diseases with them. Diseases that the Europeans had long been immune to because of many, many centuries of enduring those diseases. But these new peoples in the New World had not ever experienced these diseases, and so when the interaction took place, it wiped out vast populations. In addition to that, you also have all of the steels and everything, the gunpowder and such things as that. And so these nation states were able to race around the globe and to dominate huge portions of the globe very quickly, okay? And so that's all going on in Luther's day, and it's changing the map of the world. But the Holy Roman Empire, where Luther is, Germany, where Luther is not going to change. They're not doing this. They're not racing around the globe and doing that at all. So, for example, just as Luther is going to stand trial at the Diet of Worms, in 1521, Magellan will be completing his voyage, his circumnavigation around the globe. And so you can see this is a time of great geographical expansion. Another major change in the intellectual world, as we've already discussed a little bit, is Renaissance humanism, and this is going to engender Christian humanism. Now, Christian humanism is a little different from the kind of full-blown, full-tilt Italian humanism that we looked at with Pico de Mirandola and also with Machiavelli and Marsilio Ficino and many, many others. Christian humanism is going to be more focused on Scripture, on recovering the ancient texts of Scripture, and as we will see, translating those into vernacular languages. It's going to be one of the key hallmark parts of the Reformation, is giving the people the Bible in their own hands, in their own language, so that they can read it. And Martin Luther was at the forefront of that, and that's usually seen as one of his major contributions to Germany and to the modern world, and to the German language, is that his translation of the Bible into German is going to be formative for the language itself. So, at the intellectual world at the time of the Reformation continued along the paths laid out by the Renaissance humanism and also by nominalism. And we're going to say a lot about nominalism here in just a minute, because it's necessary to understand that, to understand the modernity that we'll see later on in this course. The humanists, especially the superstar Christian humanist Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam, had cleared the way for the reformers. The people of this age often said that Luther hatched the egg that Erasmus laid. Now, Erasmus was Roman Catholic, and he was criticizing the church and the papacy for many of the abuses and the problems that were going on at that time. He never advocated splitting away from the Roman Catholic Church. And indeed, if the truth is known and fully understood, Luther really didn't want to do that either. He didn't want to split away. He was excommunicated, and when he was excommunicated, he accepted that decision. But Erasmus was one of these early humanists, a Christian humanist, who is essentially making the path easier for Luther. Okay. And so in a way, Luther does hatch the egg that Erasmus laid. But Luther is going to be a very different man. He's very completely different than Erasmus. He's going to reject classical humanism and go off in a different direction altogether. And we're going to see that represented most fully in this debate between Erasmus and Luther on free will, where they clash and see things fundamentally different about human nature and about God. One example, though, of how Erasmus makes or clears the path and makes Luther's task a little easier is that Erasmus in 1516 had published, for the first time in the history of the world, a Greek New Testament. No one had ever published that before. And so this Greek New Testament was a complete Greek New Testament of the Bible, compiled from many different sources and manuscripts, and this enabled scholars such as Luther to take that Greek New Testament and then translate it from Greek into German. Now, that allowed Luther to skip over the Vulgate, the Latin translation of the Bible, and to go straight to the language of, or the original text of the Bible. And so many Bible translations afterwards will do that. And what that allowed Luther to do is to produce a more faithful translation than, say, one that was based upon Latin, and the Latin is itself based upon the Greek from Jerome's Vulgate. So this Greek New Testament was a triumph of humanist scholarship, and like I said, the first ever published, and it gives the Protestant reformers an extremely powerful tool for providing the people the Bible in their own language. Now, the Reformers labored to get the Scripture translated into all kinds of vernacular tongues, and Luther wasn't the first to do that. Wycliffe had done that for English, and Tyndale as well However, the Gutenberg press changed everything. And the Gutenberg press around mid-14th century allowed rapid printing because it had movable type and so forth. And this enabled rapid printing of books and to give the average man the ability to purchase a book. Before Gutenberg's press, buying a book was an extraordinarily expensive proposition. It'd be kind of like you buying a brand new car today, okay? It wasn't something that the average person could afford to invest that much money in. And so this explosion of information that came out of Gutenberg's invention is on rough scale equal to the kind of explosion of information that we have today with the internet. It was a vast leap forward for disseminating information. And so this allowed the ordinary folk to have a Bible, and it gave the ordinary folk a reason to learn to read. And so it increased literacy. And you can see that has deep social transformative effects. And the Protestant reformers are going to be some of the foremost people pushing in promoting public education so that every person can read, so that every person can own a Bible and read it for themselves. And so that is going to be a great challenge to the established order, the Roman Catholic Church and the papacy. Because up until that time, the papacy really had the scriptures locked down. It was in Latin. Very few people understood or could read Latin. And so if anyone wanted to hear the Word of God, it had to come through a priest. Now, many Christian humanists assisted in the recovery and the revival of ancient Christian manuscripts, so it wasn't just the Bible alone. There were all kinds of ancient manuscripts that were taken from Greek or Hebrew or Syriac or other languages and translated into vernacular languages. And so this was a great revival of ancient texts, a revival of ancient languages, and all this fed into the Reformation. Okay. Now we're going to move on to nominalism. Now I know I've already mentioned nominalism in the past lecture, but I'm going to go a little deeper into it because Luther was a thoroughgoing nominalist. He was pretty much to the bitter end a nominalist in many ways. He held on to his nominalist training. And so by the time Luther goes off to university in the early 16th century, nearly every university in Germany had taught nominalism. And in other words, there was a full-scale effort to move away from scholasticism to nominalism. And at the University of Erfurt, where Luther went, there were several very powerful nominalist professors there who advanced the whole theory of nominalism. And Luther deeply imbibed nominalist teachings and way of looking at the world. So let's go into this a little deeper. Nominalism created an intellectual environment that was equally as powerful as humanism. So we have two movements going on. Humanists are not necessarily nominalists, and nominalists are not humanists, but there's interplay between these two movements, okay? And so both of these are going to influence Luther and the Protestant reformers. And then the three of them together are going to engender modernism that is to come in our subsequent lectures. So modernism starts about 1630, so we're looking at about 100 years after Luther. So all three of these movements still thrive today in spirit and in culture. And so there are people today who are still deeply nominalist, humanists like myself as a professor of the humanities, and then also, obviously, Protestant reformers, people who still look back to the Protestant Reformation as a kind of the inception point of proper Christian theology. So all three of the movements, though they're not mainstream, they're still alive today in influencing people. So what exactly is nominalism? Again, this was a major shift in metaphysics that occurred around 1320 with the thought of a man named William of Akhom. Now, he didn't invent it. There were predecessors like Roscellinus from about 100 years before him. But nominalism provides a necessary precursor to the modern and contemporary age. In other words, without nominalism, we wouldn't have got to modernity. Now, again, Akhom insists that universal ideas have no existence. All the universal ideas is names. So one of the ways I try to get people to understand this and make it stick is that nominalism is kind of like nominalism. There are no metaphysical entities beyond and outside of any particular thing. If I'm to point to a chair, there's only that chair. There is no chairness. If I point to a tree, there's only that tree. And if I point to another tree, there's only that particular tree. There is no treeness. And likewise, now those are simple examples, but let's apply it to the human world. There is no humanity, there is no humanness, there are only individual people like me, Ivan Spencer. And so I'm a particular person. I'm a one-off. I'm unique, just like the tree is a one-off and the chair is a one-off. Everything is its own unique thing. None of these things are people, none of us participate in anything beyond us. We are made as individuals. And so you can see how this is a necessary precursor to the whole concept of individualism. We live in a hyper-individualistic age today. In fact, as I've said before, individualism to us is like water is to a fish. A fish doesn't even know it's in water, doesn't even know that it's wet. We too are so individualistic today because it comes from about 700 years of individualism that we've inherited. So nominalism is going to promote and make the individual important. So if all that exists are God and individuals, and that's what the nominalist said, there's nothing between God and individuals. Everything that exists is made from God. Okay, there's no intermediary metaphysical entities like humanness or dogness or treeness or whatever. None of those Platonic forms. If that's the case, where does knowledge come from? It comes from observing the particulars. And that's it. And so this forces one to focus on this world and to represent it in your words accurately, or if you're a painter, representing it accurately in your paintings. And that's why, for example, we see an explosion of Renaissance art that focuses on the particulars. And so nominalism is a huge movement and has amazing and long-lasting implications even down to this day. But why do we think that there is something like a Platonic form? Or why do we think that there is something like a universal humanity or anything like that? It's because the mind makes an illusory leap and we reify, that is, we make real the essence behind the name. But there is nothing there. It is just a name. It's an illusion. And eventually, after long use of the word, like human or tree or leaf or whatever, chair, we think that there is some essence to those things. And it's just a mind trick that we play on ourselves, says Akhom and his followers. Luther completely bought into this, okay? Luther was a thoroughgoing nominalist. Thus, the old views that dominated the world for 1,700 years, from Plato and Aristotle and Augustine and Aquinas, all the way down to the scholastics, all of that was reduced to ashes and obliterated by nominalism. To better grasp nominalism, like I said before, you have to understand something about scholasticism, because nominalism was, or Akhom creates his nominalism almost to be like a bullet to assassinate scholasticism, and it roughly did. Scholasticism preceded Akhom by 200 to 300 years, and it was in cultural ascendancy for those 200 to 300 years. And the primary schools that dominated it were realism and conceptual realism. And they were represented by Anselm and Aquinas respectively. But nominalism did exist during this time, even back before Akhom, but it was a minority view. So Anselm and the realists held that Plato's views about universals and the particulars, or the universals and Plato's forms, which I think you've studied in another course, that these were immaterial and mental concepts that existed absolutely and independently of anything in this world. So you see, this is a radically different view from nominalism. This holds that metaphysical entities such as chairness or humanness or humanity really is real, okay? And it's most real because it doesn't change. So the Christian realist usually held that these ideas were God's mental concepts or rationis aeternus. Now, this idea goes back to Augustine, a great Christian Platonist or Neoplatonist, who held that God is the one who holds all these ideas. So humanity or humanness is an idea that God has in his mind, and then as he makes all humans, then all of those humans essentially participate in that universal. Akhom is going to reject that and say God just creates every human being as an individual special creation, and there is no humanness in between, okay? Now, Aristotle's views on this are kind of an intermediary approach, and this is the one that Aquinas held, and it was seeking to kind of nuance Plato's views, but Aristotle held that universal concepts did exist, but only in a particular thing. So this is a little different from both Plato and the Nominalists. So there is a universal, but it truly exists in the thing, okay? And then Nominalists will come along and say, it's just the thing itself that exists, and universal is only a name. Okay, so you can see this, for example, in the idea of a fruit, piece of fruit, okay? I got up this morning and ate a banana for breakfast. And so Akhom would say, that banana, it was just that banana and nothing else. There is no banana-ness, there is no fruitness that banana participates in. And so everything is just a particular thing in this world, okay? So if I have a banana in my hand, it is its own unique thing. It is what it is. And so this any type of real essence that exists independent of the banana is purely a myth, okay? Now, Akhom reintroduces this idea, but he didn't completely invent it himself. He gets it from people that preceded him, but he's going to be the guy that makes it most popular and runs with it. Now, so he says there really is no fruitness behind the banana. It's only a name that people refer to. And so what are some of the consequences of this? Well, you think about it today. The world we live in is very Akhomist, or it has a lot of affinities with Akhomism or nominalism. We really don't think that things have an essence that transcends the very thing itself. And so anything can be what we want it to be. We just give things names. And so, for example, what is marriage? Well, it's whatever we want it to be. And you can see this, for example, in some more contemporary movements. What is gender? It's whatever we want it to be. And so nothing is what it is. Nothing has a fixed nature. Everything is malleable. Everything is pretty much what we want it to be. We give it the words that we want to give it, but nothing is what it is in any kind of a transcendent sense. Now, Akhom didn't know that that's where we would wind up 700 years later. And Akhom probably would have found some of these conclusions odd, but they are the outworking of this idea that the essential world is dead. There is nothing beyond or behind individual things at all. This is an anti-essentialist age that we live in now. And this anti-essentialist age creates a kind of Copernican moment for the history of ideas. The Akhomist moment is a turning point for the history of ideas and for Western culture, because we really never looked back. So the metaphysical center of things didn't just shift, it evaporated, it vanished completely, okay? Later on, you'll have people like Darwin will come along. We'll look at him later in this course as well. Well, Darwin will come along and will place a final nail in the coffin of essences with his theory that all species ebb and flow without any fixed essence, including humanity. So yes, this is ironic. We still use the word humanity as if it is something that transcends me, a particular human. But there is no humanness per se. There's merely a group of animals that we agree to call human on the Darwinist view. Okay? So, in the 20th century, postmodernity will intensely begin to analyze language and deconstruct its usage in social power structures. And it will conclude that all claims about the way things are express merely social constructions to empower cultures or particular groups of people. Okay? And so postmodernity agrees with the nominalist views. We'll see Nietzsche, for example, he's also a hyper-nominalist later on in the course. So Akhom never knew where his nominalism would lead, but it is so deeply and unwittingly assumed by most people today that any who claim the old Platonic and Aristotelian notions of actual essences seem very peculiar, even medieval. If you started talking about the reality of essences beyond this world and outside of this world, you would seem quite peculiar to contemporary people. Nominalism will lead to an emphasis on the particulars alone, and it will fuel human individualism, but it will also eventually be an important part of the beginning of modern science, which will want to focus on individual particular things. And it will have many social structures, social consequences as well for society. Okay, since only particulars exist in nominalism, any knowledge must come from observation of this world. And we will see, for example, Francis Bacon in our next lecture on the scientific revolution in his Novum Organum. We will see him begin with the nominalist position and say that we must inductively study everything. In other words, he's going to completely reject deductivism and deductive approaches to knowledge and approach the whole world of knowing and the whole epistemology of science with inductive reasoning. Okay? So this is synergistically going to flow into the Renaissance era and radically emphasize individual people. The humanists also emphasized individualist people. Artists will begin to represent people the way they actually appear, not the way they iconically, as an iconic person. Nominalism will provide the precursor to modern science, still 3 centuries away from Akhom, but not too far away from Luther. Several proto-scientists began to see things from a nominalist stance, focusing on particulars, most notably Francis Bacon, his Novum Organum, and also Thomas Hobbes, someone we won't be reading in this class, but nevertheless deeply influential on the rise of modernity. Now, during the Reformation, nominalism and humanism provided a kind of a zeitgeist in which Luther is going to flourish. The universities that he goes to are deeply nominalist and humanist, 2 separate movements that are interacting in various ways. And so the cultural feasibility of focusing on the individual person is going to be immense. And we will see that Luther also advances individualism. How? By making salvation, that is, one's eternal destiny, is going to be an individual effort or an individual event. It's my faith that leads to my salvation. And it's a transaction between me and God through Christ. Okay? And so it is not going to be a social event. It is not something that is transmitted through a social institution and so forth, such as the church. It is going to emphasize the individual. So Luther's reforms in theology envisions salvation and justification as a matter of reconciled relationship between an individual and God through Christ alone, instead of a relation mediated, regulated, and brought through an institutional church organization, which is what had stood for nearly 1,000 years before him. So, while not often acknowledged, Luther propelled individualism to new heights. The next major advance for individualism we will see will come from Descartes, who centers certainty of knowledge on the cogito, and this is the individual's rationality. After that, we'll see Immanuel Kant will place the individual at the center of all perception, and the world will conform to the individual. Okay? The individual doesn't conform to the world. The world conforms to the individual, according to Kant. And so this will basically make a lot of our understanding of the world deeply subjective. After that, we'll see Nietzsche, who will then locate the individual's will to power at the hub of all value creation and all morality. Every man makes his own rules, hammers out his own truth, and this will bring us to the threshold of contemporary culture. So I know this is a lot of background material, but it's critical to understand that and see how it all fits together to understand the Reformation. Next, we will look at the intellectual changes, other intellectual changes that are going on at this time. Okay, some other intellectual changes that we're going to see at this time, and this comes a little after Luther, but it is going to fuel the Protestant Reformation, are the shifts in our understanding of the cosmos, most notably Copernicus's work De Revolutionibus in 1543. Now, like I said, this comes a good nearly 30 years after Luther, but what's going to happen is a lot of people are going to see, all these shifts are taking place in the church, in the intellectual world, and then also in the very way that we look at the cosmos itself. And so this is, like I said, the 16th century is a time of incredible shift and change that's going on. Now, Gutenberg's press, as I've already mentioned, made rapid dissemination of information possible, but there was also the fall of the Byzantine Empire in 1453, some 50 or 60 years before the beginning of the Reformation. What this did was it drove a lot of these Greek scholars west, bringing their texts with them, which were then translated, but it also meant that the Turks were expanding. And so the Islamic world is aggressive, just as it is today. And so they're aggressively expanding west into the eastern part of Europe. So as the nation states to the west bristle with power expanding around the world, to the east were the Turks, who threatened Italy and the Holy Roman Empire. And this was a matter of great concern to the papacy at the time. The great Christian city of Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire, fell to the Seljuk Turks in 1453, after about 800 years of resistance. These Turks invaded further to the west and very close to Vienna and Venice. And so this ominous military threat made Luther's schismatic upheaval a great internal threat to unity. And so it looked like Luther was weakening the very Europe that was already a threat, under threat due to these expansions to the east. During this time, the papacy had been greatly weakened itself due to several things that happened much earlier than Luther, such as the Babylonian captivity of the papacy in Avignon, France, from 1309 to 1377. Right after that, there was something called the Great Schism, not to be confused with the split in 1054 of the Eastern Orthodox Church with the Western Church. But this Great Schism was when you had two competing papacies, one in Avignon, France, and one in Rome, both claiming to be legitimate. What this did was it created a political situation around Europe in which different nations and different territories had to figure out which pope they were going to follow. What this did was it kind of caused a decay in confidence in the papacy. And so there was a great deal of corruption in the church at this time. And so the Roman Catholic Church and the papacy had turned into not just a spiritual organization by this point, but into a vast bureaucracy with an amazing amount of power in the real world. And so with power and money usually comes corruption. And so these are some of the situations that are preceding Martin Luther's rise.